So Martin Luther may have been one of the most interesting, funny, eccentric, and just different theologians on the scene in Western civilization. And he may have helped contribute more to Western civilization than any other theologian. There are a lot of areas that are impacted by Martin Luther's Reformation. Let's talk about one of the coolest, one of my favorite theologians who's ever lived. We are going through a series on classic Christian thinkers. All right. We've already done several. We have Martin Luther in this episode, and then we'll look at John Calvin, another really important reformer, and then Blaise Pascal and C.S. Lewis. If you haven't gotten the book, go ahead and check it out. I'll leave a link in the description. Martin Luther is one of my favorite theologians. One, because he sparked the Reformation. It's just a really interesting and cool story. It's a fun story. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go on site back in 2005 all around Europe. We started in Prague and went to all over Germany and then Austria to study the Reformation. And it was so fun. And Luther is just such a fun person to study. And he's a really interesting, different kind of theologian. So let's look at some of what Martin Luther is known for. He lived from 1483 to 1546. Some of his major works include The Bondage of the Will, a really important debate he had with Erasmus regarding whether or not the will is sinful and to what extent it's sinful and to what extent we have free will and what that even means. His catechisms, as well as we'll look and see at the really cool story about the Bible that he translated into German, which had a really interesting and important effect on the German language. Now, some of his major contributions we're going to go into throughout this story is going to be salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, and then the priesthood of all believers. As the catalyst for the Protestant Reformation, he will really emphasize that salvation is not based on works in any way, shape, or form, but that it is based on grace and through faith in Jesus Christ, not on works. And he would be breaking with the Catholic Church on this point. It was a really contentious point for him to make at this time, but a really important one. So what happened? Well, to put all this in historical context, now I'm just going to give you the very highest bird's eye view. You know, in the beginning of the 1500s, the papacy had arisen to a prominent place of power and prestige. There had been a history of power struggles between the papacy and the Roman emperors and other secular rulers at the times. But the papacy had become a very, very important role and figure for the church. And the role of the papacy had evolved a lot. And it would keep evolving after the Reformation because of the Counter-Reformation. But we had a lot of important ideas at this time that Luther would challenge, such as the papacy. And at this time, imagine, if you would, going to church, and you got there and all of the Bibles were in Latin. If there even were, there weren't probably even be any Bibles for it yet at this time. But all the Bibles were in Latin. The service was in Latin. Everything was in Latin, even if you didn't speak it. So you could conceivably go to service, hear everything, the message, the mass, everything in the service, and not understand any of it. So that's what we had the services in the Bible in Latin, and most people didn't have a Bible at this time. Even some priests didn't have a Bible at this time. And there were people who were trying to reform the church before Luther. We had John Huss, the Waldensians, and several other groups and people. But there were a lot of parts that came together for Luther's Reformation to really take hold and to make traction. And one of those was the invention of the printing press, which hadn't been around very long until Luther came on the scene. The printing press made it where people could mass print books, pamphlets, and whatever. So it made things a lot cheaper, made things a lot easier to make and print, and a lot more people could have books, whatever somebody wanted to print. And so that was really, really important. And so was the political protection that Luther enjoyed. We're going to get to that later. So what happened to Luther? What is the deal with Martin Luther? Well, he was supposed to go to law school, and he was traveling down the road one day, and as the story has it, he was almost hit by lightning, and he pleaded with God, "I'll become a monk if you spare my life." And so he did become a monk. and he joined the monastery, and he had a mentor named Johann von Staupitz, and Staupitz, if you want to know how to spell it, Johann von Staupitz. And Staupitz thought he saw a bright spark in Luther and sent Luther to Rome. He wanted Luther to be able to see what was going on in Rome. He was in Wittenberg. Luther was in Wittenberg, now Germany. Germany wouldn't become Germany until 1870 or 71. At that time, it was the Holy Roman Empire, and the joke is that it was neither Holy Roman or an empire. But that's what it was at the time. It was a collection of city-states, basically. And he was in Wittenberg, which is about 2 hours or so from modern-day Berlin, on a train anyway. I think that's about how long it took us to get to Berlin from Wittenberg. And he went there, and he saw a lot of things he couldn't make sense of. He says there's a great movie on Luther, and I highly recommend watching it. It's just called Luther. There's two movies. One is an older black and white movie. I think it's just called Martin Luther. And the new one is called Luther. It came out in 2003. And when he goes to Rome, he sees the clerics visiting prostitutes and people giving indulgences and relics. Well, what are all those things? Well, an indulgence, and it's still practiced today, is where a person would pay a fee to lessen time in purgatory. And you could do that either for yourself or for a loved one. And so if you paid an indulgence, you could get someone out of purgatory. You could pay however much and get them out of time. Purgatory, if you don't know, it was a halfway house between heaven and hell where you were purged from your sin. And so the Catholic Church taught that Jesus did pay for your sin, but you still have to pay for some of your sin that goes over and above what Christ paid for. But the church taught that there was a merit, the heavenly merit that was accumulated by the apostles and Mary and different saints. And you could buy into that merit. It's called the treasury of merit. And you could buy into that by buying an indulgence. You also could do things like gaze at relics. A relic would be an old ancient artifact that had some kind of connection to the early church. It could be wood from the cross. It could be milk from Mary's breast. It could be the one or the two heads of John the Baptist that were floating around in Europe. It could be anything that was tied. And if you gazed and looked at these relics, it was supposed to also take time off purgatory. Well, one of the main problems that Luther had was the indulgence controversy, because as Luther would read the Bible, he believed that, we're not supposed to pay for our salvation. We're not supposed to do anything to earn it. It's by grace through faith. And so living in Wittenberg, he worked as a professor, and he worked under Frederick the Wise. And Frederick the Wise was the political person who helped shield Luther from the onslaught of the papacy, for what we're about to see happen. So Luther knew that Frederick the Wise had a lot of relics. They had, I think, something like 20,000 relics that were amassed. And there were two churches in Wittenberg. There is the town church, and there is a castle church. The castle church is where it was where Frederick lived, and they had a church associated with it, attached to it. And Luther knew people would be going there to see the relics, and they were going to go on All Saints' Day, which would be November 1st. So on October 31st, Luther made a list of what he thought were abuses, 95 of them, 95 theses, and he nailed them to the church doors at Wittenberg. Now, some people want to squabble that there was no evidence that he did this, but Luther's contemporary Philip Melanchthon testifies to the fact that Luther did do this. He did nail these theses to the doors, and it was, from all accounts, fairly normal to use the church doors as kind of a bulletin board. And so Luther nailed these theses up, but he did it in Latin. He did not want to separate from the Catholic Church. He wanted to reform the church. He didn't want to separate from us. So he wrote this in Latin to spark an academic debate among the clerics and among the professors and theologians in the Catholic Church. Well, someone took it down, and because of the printing press, took it down and made a bunch of copies in the local dialect, we're just going to say German. It wasn't really German, but German, the German dialect. It was is in this area, and it would become later German. And so they took it down and they spread it around, and it caught fire, and meaning it became popular. And the word got back to Rome that there was this monk who had put these up. And the reason that Luther did that is because there was a campaign by the Pope Leo X, who wanted to raise money to help finance a new basilica of St. Peter, a new cathedral for the Pope. And so Luther thought that, and so the Pope sent John Tetzel to raise money, and he was telling people about all these indulgences, and it really made Luther mad. And that's why Luther nailed these theses to the door. Well, they were taken off the door, translated, and everything. And so during this time, also Luther had several works he had written and used the printing press to make popular among the masses, and he would criticize the political powers of the church. He would criticize the fact that he didn't think that they were practicing the Lord's Supper or communion or the Eucharist or Mass correctly. And of course, the Latin Church, the Roman Church, believed that the elements became the literal body and blood of Jesus, which Luther had his own view on that, which would be called consubstantiation, where there was some kind of a real presence there, a little bit different from transubstantiation. But Luther wrote these various books criticizing the church, addressing the German nobility, and talking to them. Well, he was called to the carpet, as it were, by the Catholic Church in 1521. He landed the theses on October 31st, 1517, and he was called called the Diet of Worms, not Diet of Worms, if you see it, the Diet of Worms. And he was called on to recant by somebody he had debated earlier, John Eck. And Luther, he made his famous statement that it's not sure if he said it, but basically he said, with him, unless I'm convinced by scripture and plain reason, I cannot and will not recant. And so Frederick was afraid that the Roman Church would capture Luther and take him to the Inquisition. So Frederick, the Wise of Saxony, had his own men kidnap Luther and take him to the Wartburg Castle. He spent a couple of years there. And one of the remarkable things he did while at the castle was to translate the Bible into what now would be German. In fact, the Luther Bible became the catalyst for really what is now the German language. The German language has a lot of debt to Martin Luther in his Bible. So he translated it into German and gave it to the German people. Well, during this time, there was a lot of political unrest, and there was what was known as the Peasants' Revolt. And the princes were trying to put the peasants down. There was about 100,000 peasants that died. There was a huge revolt. And Luther gets out of the castle at this time. He's called back to Wittenberg. Ends up marrying a nun, Katharina von Bora, and has several children. And long story short, the princes begin to unite. They begin to say, we're not going to. They're called to see the Emperor Charles V, and he wants them to stop with all this stuff. Stop with their Bibles. Stop with their theology. And they say they're not going to do that. Well, that ultimately will result in the Augsburg Confession and the Peace of Augsburg, and that would lead the charge to the full-blown Protestant Reformation. And we'll see more of how this plays out other places with John Calvin next time. But this would have a remarkable influence on all things regarding Christianity, but also it would influence music, politics, economics. Luther's influence just spanned all kinds of areas. It was really a remarkable Reformation. It really emphasized individualism. It had a lot of influence in that regard. But Luther's main contribution is this notion that we do not buy our salvation. We do not work for our salvation. We simply believe. If you heard of the solas of the Reformation, we believe that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone. And that was really his main contribution. And we could say so much more about Luther. But that is the basic thrust of Luther's contribution. He had the printing press behind him. He had Prince Frederick who protected him. And I really encourage you to watch the movie. If you haven't, I'll leave a link to it in the description as well. It's just called Luther. But there are a lot of other books that are good. Of course, the one we're going through right now, Classic Christian Thinkers, is a great one. Roland Bainton was probably considered the standard work on Luther's biography. It's called Here I Stand, and there's a lot of other books here in our book in the bibliography section here that shows about other resources. Of course, the movie's in there as well. Roland Bainton, The Reformation in the 16th Century. Also, Roland Bainton, again, Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther. So I hope this was interesting to you and inspires you to know more about Luther and why, if you happen to be Protestant, why you're Protestant, and if you're not Protestant, why maybe others are Protestant. A lot more could be said here, but this is our current thinker, Martin Luther, on salvation and his views of the church and Christ. And he didn't want to break away, but it ended up with what happened. We had a complete Reformation and breaking away from the Catholic Church, and it will be furthered by other people like John Calvin and John Knox. And we'll look at Calvin next time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then.